what it looks like.
You want to bet his last prize?
Okay.
I know.
It was the worst I've ever seen it, and I've lived up here for a very long time. Okay, tonight's going to be different. I'm going to deal with I'm going to deal with two subjects that's not different. They knew each other, they were colleagues, and they were both essentially the modern equivalent of college professors. So it's very different, and different because their importance has to do with what they thought and what they wrote. And that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about. And you have to start with, believe it or not, Plato or Socrates. Socrates was a 5th century BC philosopher. He marks a great turning point in philosophy. We talk about the pre-Socratics and the post-Socratics. He's one of the most important thinkers in the West. He did not write anything, and he's not the main focus here. He did not write anything, Socrates didn't, but he became very famous as an inquirer after truth and a great concern for language too. After his death, one of his students, Plato, wrote, I think 30-some dialogues, which are supposedly dialogues that Plato had. They're written in a sort of dramatic form at symposia, which were Greek men's drinking clubs, essentially. And there's some question as to how much of what's in there is Socrates and how much is Plato. But anyhow, Plato went on to become the most important philosopher of his time. And he believed in the existence of an independent realm of what he called forms, perfect forms, which he saw as the ultimate truth. And in other words, he said, the most famous dialogue, I would assume, contains what's known as the allegory of the cave. And this is a little extended, but it's the way he explained it, so I think I'll steal it. In the allegory of the cave, he says, imagine this. There's some people who are seated in a cave looking at a blank wall. And they can't move. They can't turn their heads. They can't move at all, but they can see that blank wall. And behind them, at some distance, is a great big fire. So it's casting light on the wall. And between the people and the fire, other people will walk carrying objects. And all that the people all that the people who are held there can see is the shadows that the objects cast from the light from the big fire behind them. And he says, the world that we live in is like that. What we comprehend with our senses is only a shadow of real reality. And it's temporary and it's imperfect, and it's not the real things. The real things are the perfect forms. And he would say, for instance, no such thing as this ring. This doesn't really exist, not really. It's just a shadow cast by the perfect form of ring. Aristotle, now, this is known as the idealist approach. And this idea that there is this separate dimension, this separate higher reality of which the reality that we experience is just a pale shadow. Now, Plato had had a pupil named Aristotle. And Aristotle went exactly the opposite way. He denied the existence of anything such as forms. And he said that all reality and all knowledge are rooted in the physical world and obtained through observation. Aristotle is, in a sense, the inventor of science, almost. Plato was a sort of a visionary, Aristotle more of an observer. And he was incredibly prolific in his writings. He wrote on everything. Philosophy means the love of knowledge, or the love of wisdom, but wisdom and knowledge really kind of mix up in Aristotle. He was interested in everything. He wrote about everything. He wrote about, and to oversimplify it, and I can't help but oversimplify it because I don't understand it only so well. Plato is sort of the dreamer, the visionary, not really a mystic, but totally intellectualized. The search for reality takes place only in the mind. Whereas Plato is much more Aristotle is much more practical, sort of empirical. Knowledge is to be gained by observation of the natural world and reflection on what is observed. Plato is more metaphysical. Aristotle is basically empirical. And their impact on the world of philosophy was just, you really can't overemphasize how strong it was. Plato was sort of an academic purely, whereas Aristotle was more, as I say, an observer and more of a scientific, what we call a scientific approach. But they were both academically very influential. There's a book written by an American professor of intellectual history named Arthur Herman. I haven't read it, so don't ask me too much about it. It's called The Cave and the Light. And he sees the whole history, intellectual history of the West as one long struggle between Plato and Aristotle. And he says that societies become dysfunctional when they're either too idealistic, too much Plato, or too realistic, and no Plato, too much Aristotle. On the one hand, he says we're practical. We look out for our own interests and the interests of the people and things we care about. But we can also be idealists who make decisions not on the basis of what is immediately best for us, but for what is seems right or wrong. Now, the early Christians, and I specifically include Augustine here, were very influenced by Platonism. They were very influenced by Plato. And Plato's thought and this idea of the invisible world being the real world, the world in which we live being less real or less important. And that brings us to the first thing. That's the background. Bear in mind, we're now in the 13th century, and Plato has reigned supreme in terms of theological thinking up to this point. And then some things start changing. Albertus Magnus was born about 1200 in Germany, and he was not canonized until 1931. So, this is not a sort of St. Francis type saint whom everybody went, ooh, he's got to be a saint, he's so holy. They went, ooh, he's got to be smart, and he's so smart we're going to call him the Great, and he's known as Albertus Magnus. He's the only teacher from this period to be, or the only saint from this period to be known as the Great. He was a Dominican. He was briefly a bishop, and he was a philosopher. he was a great proponent of Aristotelianism. A lot of thinkers were dismissing Aristotle right away when he gets introduced in the Western thought, and I'll talk about the how and why of that. But he established the study of nature as a legitimate science within the Christian tradition. He was the most prolific writer of his century. It's unbelievable how much he wrote. He was the eldest son of a wealthy German lord. Went to the University of Padua. Joined the Dominican order in Padua. Remember how St. Dominic was establishing these houses near universities? It was paying off big time. He continued his studies at Padua and Bologna, both of which had Dominican houses of study, and in Germany, and then he taught theology at several places around Germany, lastly at Cologne. Sometime before 1245, he was sent to the Dominican house at the University of Paris, and there he came into contact with Aristotle. Now, the study of languages had really fallen apart except for Latin, had really fallen apart during the Middle Ages. Very few people spoke Greek. Very few people could read or write Greek in Europe. But what he came across was some works from a guy named Averroes, who was an Arab from Spain. He was one of these southern, Arabs. And he was a very strong proponent of Aristotelian thought. And he wrote a lot. And he wrote a lot that was opposed to earlier Muslim thinkers who, like the early Christians, had been much taken with Plato. He defended the pursuit of philosophy against really harsh criticism by some Arab theologians and religious leaders who thought that it was philosophy, that was no good, all you needed was the Quran, so don't even mess with any of that stuff. And Averroes argued that philosophy was not only permissible, but it should be compulsory among the elite. And what really got him into trouble, he argued that the Quran should be interpreted allegorically if it attempted to contradict conclusions reached by reason and philosophy. Now, if you know anything about how Islam works, this was absolutely anathema. So Averroes was highly controversial within the Muslim world. But now, so I was going to say something about this. This is how the study of Aristotle gets into the West. It's through Averroes and others like him, Avicenna, other thinkers. And this is why people who seem to want to glorify Islam will say, oh, they saved Aristotle and all the Greek thought for the West. No, they didn't. The people who saved it were the Byzantines. And the reason that these Muslim thinkers had access to these texts is because they started conquering Byzantine territory. It's as simple as that. It's totally due to the Byzantines that they had it at all. In Paris, Albertus lectured for 2 years on the Bible, and then for another 2 years on a book, very important book, old book. Hell, they're all old. Peter Lombard's Sentences. This is the theological textbook of the medieval universities. Peter Lombard was another early thinker, and he wrote a book called Sentences, which helped lay the groundwork for the scholastic approach to theological and philosophical writing. The scholastic approach was, here's the question, here are all the arguments for it, here are all the arguments against it, and finally, here's why I say this is the right side. That's the way it was done. And Peter Lombard's sentences was the textbook throughout the Western universities for the study of theology. In 1259, he was appointed by Pope Alexander IV to be Bishop of Regensburg in Germany, which he did not want to be. And he wasn't for long. One reason why he didn't want to be is that Magnus was a very devout Dominican monk, and according to the strict Dominican order, he wasn't supposed to ride a horse. So he walked everywhere. And that, you know, bishops are pretty peripatetic. They have to get around, but basically, what he really was a college professor. He wanted to teach. And when Alexander died the next year, he was allowed to resign as bishop, and he went back to teaching at Cologne. And from the rest of his life, only 3 more years, he was a legate for Urban IV. He was a papal ambassador to preach the crusade in Germany and Bohemia. After that, he lectured again at a couple of other places, and finally settled down at Cologne. It was probably while he was in Paris that he began working on an absolutely monumental book intended to be sort of an encyclopedia. It has been called a monumental presentation of the entire body of knowledge of his time. He wrote commentaries on a lot of the Bible. He wrote commentaries on the sentences. He made commentaries on every single one of the known works of Aristotle, both the ones that we know are genuine and the ones that we know are fakes, and adding digressions in which he expressed his own observations and speculations. He may be the person who invented the term experiment, but he didn't mean exactly what we mean by it. He means a careful process of observation, description, and classifying. He wasn't trying out theses. He was writing down what he said. He was not completely hostile to Platonic thought, and he was not as hostile to it as Aristotle was. And in someone, and I haven't found out who, some church authority, asked him specifically to write a commentary on Aristotle's Physica, the physical world, in order to, quote, make intelligible to the Latins all the branches of natural science, logic, rhetoric, mathematics, astronomy, ethics, economics, politics, and metaphysics. Took him about 20 years, during which time he met Thomas Aquinas, who was much younger and who became one of his followers. Albertus said that the way to knowledge by revelation and faith is different from the way of knowledge of philosophy and science. The way of knowledge to philosophy and science are to follow the authorities of the past according to their competence, but also to question them by making use of observation, and then to proceed by reason and intellect to higher levels of abstraction and higher levels of truth. For Albertus, these two things are not in opposition. It's not a double truth concept. One truth for faith and one truth for reason. He says all that is really true is joined in harmony. And and that while there are mysteries accessible only to faith, other points of Christian doctrine are recognizable and discernible both by faith and by reason alone. He defended this doctrine in several works against those who were more followers of Averroes, and his lectures and publications gained him huge renown. He was much quoted by not only his contemporaries, but for people for a couple of hundred years later. And Roger Bacon, the contemporary English scholar, also a churchman, who was much opposed to Albertus in many things, spoke of him as the most noted of Christian scholars. In the summer of 1248, he was sent to Cologne to organize the first general house of studies in Germany. This is where he later wound up teaching, near the University of Cologne. And he taught, studied, and wrote. Aquinas was his chief disciple during this period. And Aquinas was there only until 1252, when he was sent elsewhere. During his final years, he made two long journeys from Cologne. One was to attend the Council of Lyon, which was a very important papal council. The other was in 1277, after Aquinas' death, and I will talk about that a little later. Albertus's work represents the entire body of European knowledge of his time. And obviously there were many other people who were writing theology, but not that many writing natural science. This was an important difference. There had been the question of how much authority or what place Aristotle should have, if any, in Christian thought, was very bitterly fought out academically. And he was a very important person in making the West take Aristotle seriously and believing that there could be something worth seeing in him. But really his greatest influence from a non-Christian point of view, from a secular point of view, is his writings on the natural sciences. And he really was a unique scholar in that he was setting out to master all of human knowledge that he could, and he made a pretty good shot at it. But the main subject for tonight is Aquinas. Aquinas had been born halfway between Rome and Naples, a place called Aquina. And he was the youngest of at least 9 children. And again, born into a wealthy family of the lesser nobility at a castle, a place called Roccaseca. And Roccaseca was held by his father as a, what's the term? I've forgotten it. A feudal grant from the monks of Monte Cassino. Now, Monte Cassino was one of the biggest and most important monasteries around, not just in Italy, in all of Europe. It was exceptionally important. Benedictine monastery. Very, very wealthy and very famous for its patronage of the arts, and it was just generally a really powerful place. This castle that Thomas was born in had actually been built, and a fief was the word I was looking for, had actually been built, and it was given as a fiefdom to some secular person because it was at a very strategic position, that it guarded one of the passes over the mountains. And it was part of the, essentially it's part of the defenses of Monte Cassino. As a teenager, he was sent as a student to Naples. And there is where he fell in with the Dominicans, again, a Dominican house of studies at the University of Naples. The Dominicans were a relatively new order at this time. At the age of 19, he joined the order, and he was told to go to Paris for further study. He didn't get there. His parents kidnapped him. They had him kidnapped and brought back to Roccasecca, where he was kept in a room for a year. They were trying to convince him. They wanted him to be a monk. Well, they wanted him to be a monk rather than a friar. But they didn't want him to be one of these trashy upstart Dominicans. They wanted him to be a monk of Monte Cassino in hopes that he would one day rise high and he'd be close to home, and that's what they wanted for him. He utterly resisted. And apparently they kept him in a pretty rough conditions. There's some stories about various things that they did to try to convince him to leave the Dominicans and go with the Benedictines. But finally they gave up and let him go. And then he went on to Paris, now a Dominican, full-fledged, and was there for 3 years as a student. And then he was sent to Cologne. Now the Dominicans did this. You're going to hear a lot of traveling here. The Franciscans did as well. The Dominicans and the Franciscans, when they had people who were assigned either as students or as teachers, usually didn't leave them more than 3 or 4 years in any one place. Not quite sure why, but I don't know. But that's why all this traveling for these guys, because they were moved around. When he got to Cologne, he fell under the influence of Albertus Magnus, who was very definitely his mentor. The works that had come out of Aristotle had been translated into Latin and had become extremely widespread throughout the academic world. It was Albert's conviction, which Aquinas came to share, that the faith could only benefit from profound engagement with both intellectual philosophy and what they call natural philosophy and we call science. In other words, he became very Aristotelian. In 1252, Albert was asked to nominate a student to pursue an advanced degree in theology at the University of Paris. Thomas was 2 years younger than the minimum required age for this, but Albertus Magnus sent him anyhow, and somehow managed to get him enrolled. So he spent 4 years there, lecturing, not just studying now, but lecturing on the Bible and on, once again, Peter Lombard's sentences, that papally approved standard work of academic theology. Aquinas received a doctorate, was immediately appointed to the position Master of Theology, which means the chief lecturer in theology at the University of Paris, despite the fact that he was, once again, younger than officially allowed. They just said, we don't care, you're smart. For the next 3 years, he held the Dominican chair of theology in Paris, and he preached, he lectured on the Bible a lot, and got involved in various philosophical and theological disputations, sometimes as a referee more than this was a big thing in the academic world in those days, was actual face-to-face disputations between scholars on various questions on which they disagreed. So in 1259, he spent his 3 years there. He was sent back to Italy. And he spent most of the following 10 years in Dominican houses of study, first in Orvieto and then in Rome. And during these years, he continued to preach. I've told you about the outdoor pulpit in Orvieto. He continued to give lectures on the Bible and to conduct these, quote, disputations, academic disputations, like a two-man debate. And he began working on two very important works, by far the most important of which, for our purposes, the Summa Theologia, the summation of theology. In 1268, the Dominicans made an unusual decision. They sent him back to Paris for another term as Master of Theology there. It was unusual to go back to where you had been. And he by now had a huge reputation. And he wrote a brief, what's called a treatise, arguing for a middle ground on certain theological questions, one of which, it sounds really, whatever, whether the world could be proved to be eternal or proved to be created in time. But these years are really dominated by his efforts to complete the Summa Theologia, and at the same time write commentaries on all of Aristotle's principal works. He didn't do every single one, but he did do these. When his second 4-year term in Paris came to an end, he returned to Italy, this time to Naples. And during these final years, he nearly, but not quite, finished both the Summa and his commentary series. Instead, something happened, and nobody's quite sure what. After a year and a half, some say while attending Mass, some say while celebrating Mass, he had some sort of mystical experience. He could not, he never attempted to describe it, but it was profound. And the only thing he would say about it is, and this is a direct quote, "All that I have written seems to me like straw compared to that which has now been revealed to me." And he died a few months after that, in 1274. So he didn't live very long for someone who turned out so much work. We don't really know much about his personal life. We know he was a huge man. He was very large. We know that, but really that's about it. Because most of the stories that popped up about him after his death are poorly attested and unlikely to be true. And in his own writings, he says almost nothing about his personal life. It is strictly intellectual. Now, as I said, this is mostly about the work, because that's their importance for Magnus and Aquinas. There's a medieval saying, some of you heard me use it, I'm sure, that Aquinas really obviously took very, very seriously. Grace perfects nature. It does not destroy it. He saw nature as God's creation, which can reveal to us things about God. He thought about philosophy as a disciplined intellectual way to investigate what we can know naturally without divine revelation about God and his relationship to human beings. And he thought that good scriptural theology, since that's what it deals with, presupposes good philosophical analysis and argumentation. He did not write much that would be considered pure philosophy. Most of his philosophy is to be discovered in the context of scriptural theology. He sees philosophy as a natural and necessary precondition for reading Scripture intelligently. And even in his sermons, this comes out. He treats the huge number of subdisciplines of philosophy. Logic, philosophy of nature, metaphysics, epistemology, the idea of how do we know what we think we know. What we call philosophical psychology, philosophy of the mind, just everything. He's probably most famous for what are known as the 5 ways. These are 5 things that he wrote about attempts to demonstrate that that knowledge of the existence of God, knowledge that there is a creator God, can be derived purely from natural philosophy, that it does not require revelation. He didn't deny the reality of revelation. He's just saying it's not required. And there's a phrase that's often used to describe his thought. It's natural theology, meaning a theology that is philosophical and does not necessarily resort to appeals to religious authority. It's not, in other words, and I have tried, believe me, I have tried through the years to read Aquinas. It's very difficult reading. He is, how can I put this? If Thomas Aquinas were to hang that plaque, he'd use 17 nails to do it, okay? Everything is over and over and over and over again. Different, slight variations on the same argument over and over and over again. It's really tough reading. Thomas also offers, and I'm going to talk about this to some degree, one of the earliest systematic discussions of the nature of law. And this becomes really important in Catholic theology, and I'm going to talk about that at a little more length. His writings on ethical theory are not so much law-centered as virtue-centered, and he has extended discussions on ethics with relevance of happiness, pleasure, the passions, power of habit, the faculty of will. He really is very interested in soulcraft. How can we be better people? How do we become virtuous? And again, in the larger sense, I'm speaking again in a somewhat secularized sense. His most influential contribution is the argument that there is a correct and beneficial relationship between theology and philosophy, that neither is to be ignored, and that each reinforces the other, and that the idea of grace perfecting nature, that works through the human mind. So what's he known for best? Well, the Summa Theologica, which, even though it was not finished, nevertheless became really very important, probably the most important single text since St. Augustine in Catholic theology. the argument of the five ways, which I'm not going to bother to go into, and the concept of the the harmony between faith and reason. Again, grace perfects nature. Now, I want to talk about law theory, because that becomes, again, very influential. Thomas says there are four kinds of law. The first kind of law is eternal law, and that is God's rational plan for all creation, and we can't know anything about that. We know nothing about that, except what we can see being worked out. We can make reasoned conclusions about the nature of eternal law by seeing what we see, how creation is playing out. Second is natural law, and this is the most important in many ways. Natural law is the portion of eternal law that's applicable to human beings. Divine law is law that can be known only by revelation. So this is what comes from Scripture, the laws like the Ten Commandments. And finally, human law, civil law, criminal law. And this is very important. If a human law contradicts natural law, it is to be considered invalid. He called it an abuse of law. Mm-hmm. Now, this is a very significant contribution to the field of ethics, because what he's saying here is that moral principles are inherent in human nature and can be understood through reason. And that's going to lead to a couple, well, you'll see. It's going to lead to a couple of very important advances in thought, I think, in terms of what makes the West the West. Aquinas defined natural law, that portion of eternal law applicable to humans, as the rational creature's participation in God's law. And therefore, it should guide humans toward what is naturally good. The core principle, do good and avoid evil. That certain innate tendencies, he says, in the human, like preservation of life, reproduction, education of offspring, and seeking the truth, are all things that can be understood as good simply through the exercise of human reason. They do not require revelation. They're not divine law. Every human being should be able to discern this, that these are good things. In other words, Aquinas believes that we're designed with an innate ability to by reason to discern right from wrong, meaning that natural law is objective. It's not solely dependent on Scripture to be known, and it's not just a matter of individual taste. Natural law, if it exists, is universal law. Natural law tells us that the good things are, as I said, self-preservation, procreation, and education of children, knowledge of truth, and this he gets very much from Aristotle, the ability to live in society with others. How should we do that? And this is what, human beings are called upon to use their reason to understand what is inherently good and to strive to achieve it. In 1267, Aquinas completed a work, which was largely a development out of Aristotle's politics. He differed from Aristotle on some points, but Aristotle is the one he's dealing with. And Aquinas says it is natural for man, more than any other animal, to be a social and political animal, to live in a group. And he presents what he sees as logical proofs of this. My favorite one, he says, it is self-evident that that the purpose of human speech is to allow individuals to reason with one another. So think about that the next time somebody calls you a bad name in traffic. But that, as far as he's concerned, is why did God give us language? So we can reason with each other. Boy, that's very Aquinas. Aquinas further observed that there is a tendency to people to look only after their own self-interest. Because of this, he says, in every multitude, meaning society, I think, there must be some governing power to direct people towards the common good. Now, this is a big break with St. Augustine. Augustine saw government as a necessary evil. Didn't like it, didn't want it. You know, we should all be good people just because God tells us. But you gotta have government because some people are bad, some people are gonna do bad things. So even though it's a bad thing to have one person in authority over another, nevertheless, you gotta have it. So that was Augustine, that the main purpose of government is to keep the sinful people in line, okay? Aquinas saw that government was also a way to help people work together for the common good, for the benefit of everybody, in such endeavors as protecting life, educating children, and promoting peace. He addressed the problem of unjust rulers. And he said an unjust ruler might be a king, it might be the few rich and powerful people, or it might be the many, many poor people. Any group, any ruler, anybody with authority over others can be corrupt, can deviate from what is right and good for government to do. And he says that when rulers make laws that violate natural law, they become tyrants. And he says, this is a direct quote, a tyrannical government is not just because it is directed not to the common good, but to the private good of the ruler. All right? What should the people do about a tyranny? Well, Aquinas agreed with Augustine that the subjects of an unjust ruler are not obliged to obey the laws, since the laws are not legitimate. But Aquinas went way beyond Augustine, and pretty much every other medieval thinker on this matter. He's the first really important person to say the subjects of a tyranny constitute a public authority, and the subjects of a tyranny which is acting as a public authority might rebel and depose it. He says that this should not be done hastily, but only when it seems that the damage being done by the tyranny exceeds what might occur in a rebellion. This is probably the first serious, thoughtful justification for revolution in Western thought. It simply does not exist prior to this. He also further developed an idea that, as far as we know, had first been discussed by Cicero and later by St. Augustine, a systematic look at the question of what is a just war. Now, just war theory has been argued ever since, but he sketched out his understanding of it like this. In order for a war to be just, there must be three conditions met. The first is that the war must be declared by a legitimate sovereign authority, no private wars. The second is a just cause, either to avenge some previous wrong or to achieve some necessary good. And finally, a rightful intention to advance good or avoid evil, and not just for gain, which, quite frankly, many wars have been fought simply for gain, to grab land or goods or whatever. This was just a groundwork. Obviously, there's much more thought has gone into just war theory later, but Aquinas really gets credit for introducing it into Christian thought in the West. He wrote about what he considered the best form of government. And like Aristotle, he thought that a mixture of government forms, a mixture of bodies within a government to do different things made sense. He recognized the value of a king, of kingship, but he opposed an absolute monarch. And he said that the nobility should not only advise the king, but should limit his power. And that the king's laws must result, in order to be legitimate, from reason and have the consent of both the nobility and the common people. This is really radical. This is 13th century, people. This is, divine right of king's time. And he's saying, no, that's not right. Now, given these sort of things, and this is just a smattering of Thomas's thought, you can probably assume that he had lots of enemies, intellectual enemies, and he did. He spent his last years teaching and writing, as I said, in Italy. Died at the age of 49 while attempting to walk to France to attend a conference. The immediate reaction of the church as an institution was negative. And in 1277, the church actually condemned a number of his writings which were based on Aristotelian ideas. Now there was something, where is it? Shit, I thought I had put this, yes, here it is. I wrote that Albertus Magnus, during his final years, made 2 long journeys from Cologne. In 1277, he traveled to Paris to argue in defense of Thomas and his ideas. He was not totally successful. Many of Thomas's ideas were condemned by the church, and they stayed condemned for about 50 years. And it seems that even though the official hierarchy of the church had been very negative about Thomas's ideas, the intelligentsia and a lot of, the influence of the Dominicans to a large degree, and the Franciscans to some degree, kept them in argument. And so his works were, not only were his works mostly reinstated, but in 1323, almost 50 years after his death, he was declared a saint. The writings of Thomas, combining reason and faith, became the basis for what is official Roman Catholic doctrine. It's known as Thomism, after Thomas. And of course, his political ideas regarding natural law, unjust rulers, rebellion, divided government, influenced European enlightened philosophers who were the furthest way from being Catholics or Christians of any sort. It is interesting to me that the Protestants hated Aquinas' thought. Classic example or illustration. On December 10th, 1520, Martin Luther made his final break with Rome. He had a copy of the papal bull excommunicating him, and he burned it. And on the same fire, he burned the Summa Theologica. Now, I have really just kind of skimmed over this because it's so deep. It's too important to leave out, but there's so much in it. But frankly, time will not allow, even if I'd been on time. So I've put together something. This is just some quotes from Thomas. And I'll be honest, I have not been able to track down all of these. I usually do, so let us say quotes from, or at least attributed to, Thomas Aquinas. And they give some insight, I think, into his character as well as into his thought. And some of them are very profound and some of them really simple, but they all seem to me to make sense in terms of who Thomas was. And don't bother to take notes, I've got copies for all of you. These are all from Thomas. The things that we love tell us what we are. We must love them both, those whose opinions we share and those whose opinions we reject. For both have labored in the search for truth, and both have helped us in finding it. I like that a lot. Happiness is secured through virtue. It is a good attained by man's own will. Not so sure about that. This is a very, very, very Dominican thing, and I'm not sure if he was the first to say it. But better to illuminate than merely to shine. Better to deliver to others contemplated truths than merely to contemplate. Boy, that is Dominican all the way. You don't contemplate for the sake of just improving how smart you are or how good you are. You do it in order that you have something to share with others. Fear is such a powerful emotion for humans that when we allow it to take us over, it drives compassion right out of our hearts. That explains a lot about our love of violence.
It explains a lot about what?
Our love of violence. Love takes off where knowledge leaves off. Good can exist without evil, whereas evil cannot exist without good. And you think about that for a while. There's a lot in that. After all, God, after creation, looked at everything and called it good. It's only by perverting the good powers that the devil can do evil. This one probably won't please some of you. He who is not angry when there is just cause for anger is immoral. Why? Because anger looks to the good of justice. And if you can live amid injustice without anger, you are immoral as well as unjust. This one I really like. This is a new one to me. To pretend angels do not exist because they are invisible to us is to believe we never sleep because we don't see ourselves sleeping. Three things are necessary for the salvation of man: to know what he ought to believe, to know what he ought to desire, and to know what he ought to do. And I thought about that one a lot. Firstly, because the emphasis on knowledge, which, very Dominican, very intellectual, very college professors. But also, three things in that, I'm gonna talk about this one for a minute, cause this one hit me more than the others. To know what he ought to believe, to know what he ought to desire, and to know what he ought to do. Notice he says, to know it. But he doesn't say it's necessary for the salvation to believe it, or necessary for salvation to desire it, or necessary for salvation to do it. He says necessary to know. What does that mean? It means he knows we all fall short. It's the knowledge of what ought to be, or what we ought to be, that makes it so hard to live without knowing that you're forgiven for not always being what you ought to be. Does that make sense? It makes sense to me. That we are, yeah, he's not saying we're perfect. He's saying we know we ought to be. And that is what is necessary for salvation. Not being perfect, but knowing that we should be, and going humbly to God, asking him for help in getting further. It is only God who creates. Man merely rearranges. I like that. We use the word creativity, but really in early stages of the development of English, creation was always ex nihilo, out of nothing. We would not say that a person who makes a statue, that they created it. We say they made it, because creation was something that was just God's. Another reason why the Protestants hated him: beware of the person of one book. Yeah. Beware of the person of one.
Why would that be, why do Protestants like that?
Because they consider the Bible one book.
Okay.
And it's a sort of
Okay,
Quranic approach.
yeah,
This is all I need to know. This is my only book.
yeah.
And he said, no, that doesn't work. You need more than one book. Some of us need a lot of books. God has no need for our worship. It is we who need to show our gratitude for what we have received. And finally, the soul is perfected by knowledge and virtue. So that'll give you some sense of who Thomas was, I hope. And I wasn't kidding. I do have copies of the Easter egg one once, so I'm going to keep one from you. So next week, we will get back to more normal, okay? With more good stories about saints rather than just saints' ideas. But that's the importance of Magnus and Aquinas, are their ideas. So that's what God made them, and that's what they gave back to God, was their work in the mind. And it has had a very profound influence. Oh, by the way, I didn't even mention this. Is there a hymnal up here?
Yes,
Where?
I'll be just to your right, it's just the
Oh,
second
right
shelf
here.
down.
No, this one. We sang some of Aquinas on Maundy Thursday, and I believe maybe yesterday as well. Let me find it. Aquinas was the most significant liturgist and really polymathic scholar of his day. And he was actually, as Gwen reminded me last week, there is a feast day called the what is it?
Corpus Christi.
Corpus Christi, yes. For some reason, the American church, when it was founded, I guess because of the 18th century, I don't know, was the only branch of the Anglican communion that did not include Corpus Christi in its prayer book. But it is celebrated, not finding it here, it is celebrated in all the others. And it was Aquinas who was called upon to write the propers for that feast. I can't seem to find it here. I'm sorry, my eyes are just terrible. To write the propers for that feast, that is to write the collect for the day, which is absolutely perfect. And he wrote music, and not music, but he wrote the words. And I don't see it here. Darn, that's terrible. I'm surprised. I don't know why, but we have a couple of hymns by Aquinas in the I don't know. It's not listed. In the hymnal, including some we use there. But the collect for Corpus Christi is Almighty God, Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who gave us the wonderful sacrament of his body and blood to represent his death and to celebrate his resurrection. Strengthen our devotion to him in these holy mysteries, and through them renew our unity with him and with one another through Jesus Christ our Lord. It's a lovely collect, and that's Aquinas. So, we will meet next week. Next week, I think, meet Monday night, and after that, we'll shift to Wednesdays. So that gives everybody plenty of time to
Is there a
adjust.
time for a question?
Ma'am,
Could you clarify for me, anyway, the difference between philosophy and theology? I think that the way it's been used in there, that philosophy is more based in reason, whereas theology would be more Platonic with idealistic things. I'm not sure.
theology is the study of the ways of God, period.
Period. Okay.
Yeah.
And philosophy, the study
That's why we do not speak of Greek mythology as theology.
Okay. But then philosophy is the study of, it's based in reason. Is that the idea?
Yes.
Okay.
And it depends on, it does. And there are different schools. Some would say, now, here's the difference between Socrates and Aristotle. Socrates, not so much Plato, but Socrates would say, you really want to seek the truth? Think harder. That's it. Just think harder. Think. It's all inside your head. Whereas Aristotle would say, you got to have something to think about. Go look at stuff. See what the world is like. And Aristotle's influence was so great in the medieval period that he was known just as the philosopher. And it was his observations of the natural world, or his writings about the natural world, became, quote, settled science for a very long time, despite the fact that many of them are dead wrong. Well, they are. I think he's one of, he believes in spontaneous generation. That is, if sunlight shining on a pool could make insects appear, things like that. He had some really weird ideas about human anatomy. Often he was writing, obviously, what people thought at that time. Not, sort of common knowledge, but it was wrong. Right? But man, and he really held a terrific grip on the Western mind up until probably 16th, 17th century, really. But the early, again, I said this before, with regard to the question of what is philosophy, to the earliest, the Greeks, it was both wisdom and knowledge of the visible and of the invisible.
Okay.
And you know, they did some marvelous things. I mean, they taught the West how to think systematically, and they came to a lot of funny conclusions, but they were thinking systematically, and that's what we do. It's one of the big, the influence of Western philosophy is one of the things, along with Christianity, that makes a difference between East and West.
Mm.
We think differently.
Mm.
We really do. And it's hard to imagine what the world would be like without, it's hard to imagine, it's impossible to imagine what Christianity would be like without the influence of the philosophers, particularly the Stoics.
Particularly.
The
The
Stoics.
Stoics.
Randolph, Magnus, you mentioned, or did I misunderstand, was canonized very,
Very late, 1930s.
why? Why the delay and what was the difference?
I have no idea. I really don't know. Sorry. I
Okay.
just know that it happened. I don't know what the impetus was for his canonization. I do know that he was named the doctor of the church, and that may have had something to do with it. And I'm just not sure what it was about the times that meant that was when it happened. But I don't know. Maybe I can find out. If I can, I'll tell you all next week.
And Aquinas was canonized,
About 50 years
After
after.
years
okay.
Yeah, he was in,
1931, the other guy.
at the time of his death, there was a great reaction against some of what he had written, but not all. But later, I think further study tended to show that it hung together. You know, I know we have a couple of pictures, and I don't know what they are because I couldn't find anything that I liked. But oh yeah, okay, yeah.
All
There's Italy. Where Aquinas was born was actually in the kingdom of Sicily in those days. Is that the castle at Aquina? No, that's something totally different. That's totally different. That's not relevant.
Is it the Kingdom of Sicily?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the
Yeah.
red.
What later became known as the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies,
Okay.
because it was under the, I think it was the French who were holding it at this
Well.
point, and it included Sicily.
Okay.
Well, there's the mainland Sicily, and
Yeah, it was a lot of the
A lot of
mainland,
it,
cause that's
yeah.
way up there. I really thought it was more down around here, but it went much farther north than I realized.
well, yeah.
You
That's
realize,
Trouble 13th century though.
it wasn't until the 1860s that Italy was unified.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of places here that used to be, you know, something,
Many kingdoms.
these are, you know, way over here, this isn't Sicily anymore. This is France. I mean, this isn't Italy anymore, this is France, yeah.
Could
But
you-
Randolph, Greek is gone as the universal language, and now we've got Cologne and Paris and
A lot of places,
Bologna
Bologna,
and
yeah.
people going all over. Were these folks that multilingual
No, they were working in Latin,
in Latin?
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Greek had pretty much died out in the West, but Latin remained, and it was the language of the educated. It was the language of law,
All
the
right.
language of religion.
Much as English has become the universal language of grad school. No,
Actually, that is
seriously.
true. I know.
Seriously.
I
It
know.
was the lingua franca.
Yeah, it really is. I had a Canadian professor tell me that, this was many years ago, that he'd been invited to lecture in Denmark. It was a telephone conversation. And he said, I'm sorry, I don't really speak a word of Danish. All I speak is, all of the only languages I have are English and Greek. And the guy laughed at him and said, all of our courses are in English.
Yeah.
He said, do you realize how expensive it would be to print those textbooks in
Exactly.
Danish? No, it matters. Yeah. And so, to be, I've said it 100 times, to be born speaking English is to have won the linguistic lottery. Because everywhere you go, somebody speaks English.
Yeah.
Could you show that picture of where Aquinas' remains were buried, that beautiful church? I just want to see it again. It's sort of orangey and really tall.
I'm getting to it.
Rick had it up, you didn't see it.
Rick had it, yeah.
Well,
it's-
thank you, Rick, for finding some good things to
Yeah,
show.
that.
There we
That
go.
one. The remnants is
The
the
remains
Church
on
of the
the-
Jacobins in Toulouse. Isn't that beautiful?
In Toulouse,
Isn't
that's
that-
interesting.
Yeah, it's,
Huh.
I didn't know whether it was a cartoon or a real.
I got skull pictures too.
You got what?
Skull pictures.
Skull.
Well,
His relic.
Oh, okay.
the church that Thomas taught in Orvieto is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the most striking in the world. Unfortunately, it was made that way after, long after he was dead. So, he's late medieval, Thomas is, and that, the best work there is early Renaissance. So, I'd like to get back and see it one more time. We'll see.
At several times in my career, I was a fly on the wall during serious discussions among very senior military leaders. And those discussions often involved what they call the human life values, which were essentially the natural law.
Yeah. It's
And I saw a huge shift in the outlook of our Army leaders when Westmoreland left Vietnam and Creighton Abrams took over. And there's been a long sequence of philosopher general leaders in the military up through Petraeus and continuing. And things like, are we gonna sign the international treaty on landmines or not? Those kinds of arguments.
They are moral arguments.
Yes, they are.
If you're, but the whole, so much of trying to live a Christian life is weighing one thing against another, because we don't have perfect, we don't have perfect vision, we don't have perfect judgment. And I think that really becomes super clear in two areas. One is military operations. And one of the criteria, one of the just war criteria now is appropriate means. And the other is medicine.
The other is what?
Medicine.
Mhm.
Whereas, I forget who said it. I never can remember who says all these good things I wish I'd said first. Science can tell us how to do things, but it can't tell us what to do. You gotta have something deeper to know what to do. And again, what not to do. And it's not easy. And I think a lot of these questions, there's room for legitimate, disagreement among people of goodwill. There's room for legitimate disagreement among Christians. But I would say that, generally speaking, the more radical arguments are always wrong. I know a lot of Christians have a lot of respect for pacifists. I don't. I really don't. I think to say I would rather stand by and see harm done to an innocent than intervene. No, that's I can't take that as a moral position. On the other hand, kill them all, let God sort them out doesn't appeal to me either.
But that's a little messy.
However, if forced to make a choice, I'm a horrible human being. I have kept y'all long, and I do apologize again.
Thank you so
I don't
much.
know how early I have to leave in order to be certain of getting here on time. Maybe after lunch. Next week, Monday, the week following Wednesday.
Next week is Thomas Jefferson's birthday.
Oh, good. Who's
On the
bringing the cake?
13th. On the 13th.
I did not realize that.
Thank you, Ray.
My eyes have been so itchy and I think it's